Hello everyone, Remix Review Guy here. I review remixes. In this video we are looking at Bronski Beat, a band who offered an emotive glimpse into the trials, tribulations and further trials of being an openly homosexual man in the 80s. On their 1984 debut album, provocatively titled The Age of Consent, the production duo of Steve Bronski and Larry Beat... I'm sorry, that joke's too obvious. The production duo of Steve Bronski and Larry Steinbachek forged a dark electronic melodrama to outline the ups and downs of queer life in the UK. They weren't the only synth-pop group to offer this in 1984. Soft Cell offered up gritty relationship tales, Frankie Goes to Hollywood brought big production and shock value. But besides their outspoken directness, Bronski Beat had one not-so-secret weapon that distinguished them from the pack. Jimmy Somerville, the instantly recognisable countertenor who could simultaneously express joy and pain in one unforgettable yelp. Now, as albums go, this has had reinterpretations aplenty over the years. In 2025 though, they dropped what I believe is the first entirely remix-based update of the album, in the form of Forbidden Fruit. And far from merely being just a collection of odds and sods from previous releases, this 12-track reinvention largely focuses on previously unheard material, with new takes from modern producers, guest vocal turns from trusted kindred spirits, and the occasional in-house variation for good measure. What made these fruits so forbidden, and how far do they run away from the tree? Well, before we find out, let's talk about the Age of Consent. Well, that's that video demonetised. When I reviewed Blue Moon Safari by Air earlier this year, there was a phrase that the remixer Vegan used in an interview that really resonated with me. Happy melancholy. This jumped out at me because it's a mood that I've been really interested in music for a long time. My mum used to play these 80s synth pop compilations in the car when I was growing up, and they were rife with that kind of sound. Maybe it was the technology of the 80s, maybe it was the social climate, or the fear of the Cold War defrosting. But there was just this whole strand of pop song that had this streak of misery to them and weren't even trying to hide it. And yet, something about the beat, the textures, the melodies, the overall package somehow conspired to make it feel uplifting. And above all else, there's been one song that has long sprung to mind whenever I've thought about this vibe. Smalltown Boy by Bronski Beat might be the quintessential avatar for uplifting depression. I can't think of any other song that so precisely made such a miserable experience sound joyous whilst also still miserable. And right from the beginning, the song stakes its claim through trepidation. That synth bass comes in with those bleak chords, and then you get those instantly recognisable keys. Something kind of glassy, porcelain, fragile about the sound of these keys, which is perfect for this riff because this is the melody of a light bulb moment. For those not in the know, Smalltown Boy is a song about leaving your hometown due to intolerance. And as an openly gay electropop band from the 80s, the reason why Somerville feels like he has to leave is pretty obvious when you know that context. And yet, it's a song that never explicitly acknowledges it in the lyrics.
It was supposed to be a story that was kind of universal, you know, that could be related to anybody's situation, and not just about being gay, and that was the most important thing.
In modern terms, this also offers a stark contrast to the most recent coming out anthem du jour, Pink Pony Club by Chapel Roan. The theme of that one is about moving to somewhere to thrive, whereas Smalltown Boy is about moving from somewhere to survive. The destination isn't clear, all we know is that the starting point is untenable. And if you think small towns have evolved in the 2020s, well, there was another song about small towns that reached #1 in the US a couple of years ago that gives a pretty bleak account of those environments. Okay, so that song wasn't about sexuality, but that confrontational thuggish mentality feels very similar to the one that would other certain members of communities. Intentionally or not, it's a song that characterises small towns as not particularly welcome places. So yeah, there's a universality to this song. But the urgency of having to leave is communicated far beyond the lyrics. You can tell how urgent it is for the song's protagonist to leave town, given that it starts off by doing something that very few synth pops actually do, which is changing tempo. Somerville's narrator needs to get out of Bigottsville so urgently he's actually going to speed the song up, even though it's much easier to just let the drum machine do its thing. But it's not just the beats per minute that add to the uplifting side of the song for me, it's also that bridge. For all the moody sadness of those chords on the chorus, the fact that you then have this instrumental break with these whimsical chimes that give it a real Dancing Skeletons feel, just neatly punctures through like a rush of endorphins. And then of course Somerville's instantly recognisable vocals. The vibe of his singing hits a interesting middle point, the powerhouse delivery of 70s disco singers combined with a kind of choir boy innocence. But yeah, an amazing song, and one that surprisingly doesn't pop up until the beginning of side 2 of their debut. And given how good it is, it made me wonder going into this album why I hadn't heard any of the other songs from this project. The album opens with its second single, and a song that does a lot of very similar things to Smalltown Boy. Why? This one is another up-tempo stomper about facing persecution for your sexuality, but unlike Smalltown Boy, Why is explicit about homosexuality. Which, in 1984, I can definitely see hampering the circulation of the song. It still reached number 6 in the UK charts, which is only 3 below Smalltown Boy. But the main reason why I don't think this song is as well remembered is because I just don't think it's as well realised. Due to the darker, more violent imagery of the lyrics, it seems that they go further in the direction of jauntiness, with a high-energy synth line very reminiscent of Giorgio Moroder's The Chase. Alongside a melody that sounds like a kazoo in a phone box. And then there's this synthesized brass section that rounds it off. One phrase that I try and avoid using in reviews as much as I can is dated, because to me it's always felt like a rather imprecise critique, especially in the 2020s where pop music has become an omnivorous free-for-all, whereby sounds from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s and the noughties are all just fair game and feel welcome. Whereas pretty much every AI video I've seen in the last few years already feels dated to this specific period in time. With Why, I feel like it's not necessarily the individual elements that sound dated to me, because I'm sure I've heard each of these sounds used in more modern compositions individually and they've sounded fine, even the brass. Although if I could single out one element that's a bit of a fall guy, then I'd say it's the drums. For some reason, a lot of drum machines in the 80s just went really ham, like a tumble dryer falling down the stairs. Now, maybe that's partly because the technology was just bigger back then, so everything sounded bigger and weightier and more cumbersome. Maybe it was more symbolic, representing the bloat of the 80s. It's certainly not specific to technology, because if you listen to any hair metal song, the drums on those sounded huge in a way that feels kind of antiquated now. I feel like if I replaced the drums on this with some sort of light-footed breakbeat, maybe it would sound much less specific in time. Let's try it. Yeah, I think I understand music. And conversely, if we put some modern production over these drums, it doesn't matter how bad or good that sounds, we're going back to the 80s. And for me, this is a stumbling block for a fair chunk of this album, even though there's a lot that I enjoy melodically and find pretty immersive atmospherically. And some of the slower tracks, like Screaming, make great use of that. You've got spare but effective use of the snares here, with underpinning chords that sound like a diving bell. And there's all these little bits of electronic interference over the top as well, which is perfect for the theme given that it feels like an ADHD pile-up of queer existentialism, culminating in Somerville screaming. And regardless of the sound design, this actually feels like a way that Bronski Beat were ahead of their time, as it's a song that not only represents LGBTQ issues, but also touches heavily on how those affect one's mental health. Steve Bronski was asked in an interview whether he was sad that songs from the Age of Consent still hold relevance today, to which he responded that he was happy that his songs still helped people. I'm sure he wasn't happy that the societal issues were still there, but perhaps he was just being a realist about it. But yeah, thematically, it's the songs about sexuality that really seem to have held up the best here, and I'd argue that it's the broader political songs on the album that sound the most dated to me. We've got the anti-war sentiment of No More War, for example. And the anti-capitalist concerns of Love and Money. Not saying these are dated in the sense that war and capitalism have been solved, because they blatantly haven't. It's more that the commentary in these feels a little more surface level than the sexuality-based stuff does. I feel like songs that simply say war is bad peaked with Edwin Starr, and now it feels like anti-war music works better when it moves towards unpacking the cultures and behaviours that actually lead to war in the first place. Although doing that doesn't automatically mean you get great music. Then you've got Junk, which is about the endless supply of crap that we're fed by the media.
Process all these potions, junk food, junk clothes, dressed in junk from head to toe.
This one was inspired by when they were recording part of the album in the US, and the sheer bombardment of grotesque adverts that hit them when they switched on their TV. Again, not necessarily a sentiment that has aged badly in and of itself. The artery-clogging trash we're exposed to now comes more from social media and YouTube and TikTok. One interesting thing about Junk, though, is it's the one song on the album where Somerville's vocals largely reside outside his trademark falsetto range. I'm not sure why, I'm not even sure if it's actually him, as it's quite a jarring shift, given how consistently he sings in that register elsewhere. And then you've got Bronski Beat's take on climate change, Heatwave. This one actually would have been ahead of its time if it had actually been about climate change. I mean, if it is, then he gets distracted very early on. This is a fun little track nonetheless, though, offering up a slightly different string to Bronski Beat's bow, as it's very much got that Peggy Lee Fever vibe to it.
Fever that's so hard to bear, you give me fever.
We've got the upright bass, the hand clicks, and the harmonica-esque sound, culminating in what sounds like tap dance noises in the second half. Seems that one way Bronski Beat tried to temper the dystopian synth pop on this album is by throwing in a little bit of that good old musical theatre. The second track on the album, It Ain't Necessarily So, for example, is from the Gershwin opera Porgy and Bess, and after Smalltown Boy, I think this might be my favourite song on the album. This one tempers the synth pop vibe with more acoustic instruments, like flute and sax, giving it a kind of bossa nova feel. You've also got the choral backing, courtesy of the Pink Singers Choir. Moses was found on the stream. Moses was found on the stream. There's something about this sudden lapse into exotic elevator music that feels simultaneously both ominous and wholesome on this album. The other, more richly mined source for cover versions here, though, is Donna Summer. Perhaps partly as a nod to her involvement with the development of synth pop, but also a reference to her 80s born-again Christian rebrand that reportedly resulted in some rather barbed comments about the gay community, which she strongly denied. And so here you get Need a Man Blues, which is a partial cover of Summer's song from 1975. Appropriately, we do have a little bit of second-hand Marauder in the production, with the slightly apocalyptic disco feel guiding matters. Although it's a little chirpier than some of the other songs here, with the fun bass that occasionally snakes towards a Seinfeld music sting. by which I mean the sitcom, not the DJ. But if you really want to hear Bronski getting their full Donna Summer on, then that's saved for the last track, a cover of I Feel Love. On the one hand, it's almost too obvious to include this as a cover on this album, given the high energy link, but structurally I Feel Love has always been an interesting song, as it's much more about the harmonic layering and vocal flexing than it is about the songwriting per se. The lyrics are hyper repetitive, and that seems like the whole MO, to allow the singer to just riff on it to their heart's content. And for a vocalist like Somerville, this is an absolute playground. Musically, it doesn't necessarily have the warmth of the Moroder original, and I'm not even convinced it's trying to achieve that. But vocally, it very much does it justice. And just when you've settled into the vibe of this one, it turns out this is actually a medley in the classic soft cell vein, as halfway through it suddenly shifts into the minor key melancholy of Johnny Remember Me. The original is a song by John Layton from 1959, produced by early avant-pop maverick and landlady nemesis Joe Meek. A song whose subject matter about loss and mental health proved so disturbing that it was actually banned in certain quarters. And here it offers a beautiful juxtaposition with I Feel Love, with this sudden left turn into full-blown tragedy. It makes it seem like this album is going to end on a massive downer, but just at the right moment it switches back into I Feel Love for the final furlong. An absolute masterclass in shifting between disparate moods on this. So that's The Age of Consent, an album that in some ways still feels surprisingly fresh 41 years down the line. It definitely has moments of songwriting that are more of its time, but its meditations on the connections between sexuality and mental health still feel pretty universal in 2025, which is sad for society but good for the art. It is very much Somerville's vocals that are the cornerstone of this album, the through line that holds it together and takes it over the top into something truly memorable. When Somerville left the band after this album, they continued with other vocalists, and the band remained a thing up until the death of the two producers in recent years. But the lightning in a bottle of Somerville's commanding voice was sorely absent from the rest of their discography. It does kind of make sense that he went in his own direction with the Communards, as good as The Age of Consent is, it's a sound that will definitely need you to have a break from it afterwards, because emotionally it's pretty heavy. And as for the production here, for all that I struggle with how chronically 80s some of it is, it does make for a solid and compelling sound world for the album. But of course, things like that are why I really enjoy reviewing remixes, as production and technological innovation evolves over time. Of course, one downside of this approach is that it can result in updates of old songs that just shamelessly conform to current trends, rather than creatively exploring other avenues for the songs in question. So where does this remix collection fall on the scale?
Broken I lie, all my feelings denied, blood on your face.
Forbidden Fruit is, broadly speaking, split into two halves. The first half is dedicated to remixes from outside guests, whilst the second half is largely focused on alternate takes and versions created in-house by the Bronski Beat team and associates. As far as I can tell, nearly all of the remixes here are brand new, although 3 of them did appear in short form on last year's 40th anniversary release of The Age of Consent. And we start with one of those tracks here, courtesy of Superchumbo's extended version of Why. I initially assumed when I first saw the tracklist for this album that this one would have been made a few decades ago, given that I've not heard anything from Tom Stephan's Superchumbo project since 2002. I believe the most remembered track of Superchumbo is the club banger Revolution. Although personally, I was a lot more fond of his techno remix of Get Your Freak On by Missy Elliott. For me, it just makes such an iconic song funnier. Anyway, Stephan's remix of Why foregoes the cheery stiff upper lip of the original and leans much more into the fear with a dark minimal techno groove. As a backing for Somerville's vocals, it has quite a bit of utility, making the loneliness conveyed hit harder than the original for me, particularly when he's doing the scales. Then halfway through, this ominous melody comes in just to ensure that the production isn't too dry. It's fine, but for an occasion such as this album, I would be feeling, welp, a club beat, some pleasing synths, this is alright, but where's the curveball? What can we add to turn this from a functional dance floor tool into something truly special? What's Neil Tennant up to?
Contempt in your eyes as I turn to kiss his lips.
I've no idea how this collaboration ended up being a thing, but the voice of the Pet Shop Boys winds its way onto this remix to add a spoken word rendition of the verses, and it hits. Tennant has been no stranger to a bit of irony in his vocal delivery over the years, but here it's a straight up no nonsense recital of the hard truths.
Never feel guilty. Never give in.
It takes you away from the beauty of Somerville's soprano and forces you to engage with the actual content of the lyrics, and personally I think that's an inspired move. It does still feel a little bit workmanlike production-wise for me, but the contrast in vocal styles gives this an edge that I was not expecting, and that's something that we also get from the two inevitable EDM reworks of Smalltown Boy that occupy this album. Which is important because there is absolutely no shortage of EDM reworks of Smalltown Boy at this point. Official ones, bootleg ones. You could probably fill the Large Hadron Collider with the amount of dance producers that want a slice of that classic refrain. One of the remixes from the 40th anniversary edition that didn't make it onto this compilation was from Dave Alday and Tall Paul. That sounds exactly how you'd expect a Eurotrance rework of this song to sound. So having a USP on your Smalltown Boy remix is very important. Now the first version we get here is from a production duo called the Knocks, who've done a fair bit of their own synthwave pop over the last few years, with a vocalist called Dragonette. On the face of it, their version of Smalltown Boy doesn't do a huge amount that you wouldn't expect. The drums are perhaps a little more Italo-disco than I would have anticipated, but otherwise you've got the original melody and choruses intact, plus a 90s style rave piano. Kind of weird hearing such a busy chord sequence on top of the melody like this, I'm not gonna lie. Musical phrasing of each part seems quite different, so it's a bit of a sludge of uplifting sound you have to wade through here. But yeah, this all sounds like business as usual on first listen. So much so that you might actually miss that the verses have been re-sung by Perfume genius. They blend in fairly well with Somerville's chorus, but there's a breathiness to the sweet-smelling Smarty Pants vox that just makes it sound slightly off. And it's a very odd decision, given that he doesn't change any of the lyrics or do anything different with the melody. It's just a straight-up impression of the original, more or less. Which, you know, cool to get a contemporary queer vocalist in on the action, but just the way he's used here I find baffling. But not necessarily in a bad way. The other version of Smalltown Boy comes much later in the album, courtesy of Planningtorock, and is for my money the superior of the two. Now I checked out some of Planningtorock's discography and I really enjoyed their album Powerhouse. Great little collection of synthesized soul with heavily auto-tuned vocals that has some great melodies and a very personal feel to it. Subsequently, they've gravitated more towards club productions, and that's very much the case here. This version actually changes the production up more significantly, synthesizing the melodies into this faster, more trim hard dance bounce that almost recalls the late Tony DeVitt. It's pretty cool. I like how it's effectively just overhauling the sound, which is unusual for a Smalltown Boy remix. But the real standout detail on this version is the new spoken word section from Planningtorock themselves.
I was 12 years old when I first heard this song, and it had a massive impact on me.
I'll be honest, I'm struggling to remember another instance of a remix where the remixer actually reviews the original song halfway through. I mean, I'm happy for it to be common practice, it would make my job a lot easier. I'm a bit conflicted about this device because on the one hand, planning is correct.
And it's still just as relevant today.
As discussed earlier, Smalltown Boy absolutely has enduring relevance beyond being a gay man in the 80s, with pertinency for people at all ends of the LGBTQ spectrum. And given that there are factions like the LGB Alliance, acceptance isn't necessarily straightforward, even in queer circles. But usually when a guest vocalist adds some sort of commentary, it's in the form of a verse or a rap, a poem, some sort of hype shout out. I don't recall ever hearing what sounds like a press release in the middle of a song, and it feels like it kind of pushes this version outside the dance floor into autobiographical performance art. However effective it is aesthetically though, it makes it one of the remixes that I thought about the most after my first listen, so absolutely cannot deny that what Planning's doing here made an impression. In terms of the other guest takes here, the most futurist rendition comes from Gareth Jones, a producer who has worked on and off with Depeche Mode, as well as with Erasure, so his synth pop credentials are well established. His version is called the Electrogenetic remix, after a dark ambient solo album he made in 2020. And the sound world created for this version very much reflects that vibe. It's moody, atmospheric, and although it has a beat of sorts, it's the least dance floor friendly out of any of the guest remixes here. I actually enjoyed this remix a lot on my first listen, but one particular detail has hampered my enjoyment of it more and more on each engagement, and that's the stuttering kick drum he uses on every second bar. I'm no stranger to glitching beats like this, and I can enjoy them when they're used in a more dynamic fashion, but the loop here is very regimented and doesn't evolve throughout the 7-minute track, and as far as deliberate blemishes goes, it just feels a little too stiff and calculated for me. By contrast, the two most 80s sounding remixes are delivered by Roland Sebastian Faber under the pseudonym of RSF Metropol, a nod to his 2022 Italo-disco revivalist album Metropol Nights. Listening to that album, gotta say he's got a lot of those sound signifiers down to a T. Which, frankly, is kind of a mixed blessing for me, particularly in the context of his Bronski Beat remixes. In the case of his version of Love and Money, for example, he goes for a more melodic electro take, and I personally feel this is the best guest remix here. It feels like it's working with sounds from the 80s that were very much worth keeping. Got the 808 drum that gives the track a more portable, mobile feel than the heavy kicks of the original. And the various keys used in the layering here very much add a lot of flavour to this one that make it a lavish update. By contrast, Faber's version of Niederman Blues zones in on a lot of the sounds from the 80s that I feel haven't held up quite so well. With its cheesy synth noodling and those hand clap sounds, both of which already sound like they'd be at home on the original Bronski Beat tracks. I won't deny that it's solidly put together, but out of all these external remixes here, it feels the most like one that Bronski Beat could have made themselves, and to me that makes it a tad redundant for a collection like this, especially since we get Bronski's own sound writ large on the following track, and I mean large. At the time, Bronski did do some alternative versions of their I Feel Love cover, featuring another prominent voice from queer 80s synth pop, Mark Almond from Soft Cell. Not out of the closet yet, but his music had been offering Easter eggs for those clued up. It's a great little duet, both Somerville and Almond sound like they're having a ball trading verses on this, and consequently they decided to wring as much out of this idea as possible by releasing a 9-minute version, which also included an intro cribbed from another Donna Summer classic. Now, I talked about Love to Love You Baby in my Mariah Carey video last year, but if you know the lore of these two summer songs, you'll know that both of them ended up with extended versions that brought their runtimes up to 16 minutes each. And with this recently unearthed Ultramix, the Bronski Beat medley finally reaches its logical conclusion. Yep, 15.5 minutes of Somerville and Almond playing off each other. And you know what's great about it? They managed to keep it mostly pretty engaging. The first 3 minutes are Love to Love You Baby, and they definitely don't shy away from recreating the core vocalizations of that song. I feel like I should probably put NSFW on any videos that contain this song in future. Then it speeds up into I Feel Love, and the duo proceed to trade verses and choruses like it's the gay equivalent of Rapper's Delight. And whilst we don't get the full Johnny Remember Me in this version, the chord change is still there, offering some welcome variation after the 10-minute mark. And then eventually they wrap it up. Several times. Yeah, they just keep on faking out the ending until they eventually run out of tape or voice or both.
Love to love you, baby.
And at this point you might be thinking, well, that's all well and good, but where's Johnny? What happened to Johnny? How could they forget Johnny? Well, firstly, how could Johnny forget me? That's the real question. And secondly, don't worry, he's right there in the next track.
Johnny.
Somerville and Allman dish out a self-contained version of Johnny Remember Me titled A Jazz Affair. And true to its name, this is pretty much just a jazz ballad version. In fact, this is the one track on Forbidden Fruit that has pretty much no obvious electronic elements to it. It's not fully unprecedented given that you've got the more lounge and show tune down-tempo numbers from the original, but even with that, conceptually this feels like it should stick out like a sore thumb. And yet, in the elaborate chaos of Forbidden Fruit, it fits right in. And given that you've had 16 minutes of high-energy disco before this, it's the perfect palate cleanser for getting your breath back.
Why don't you remember me?
It's not necessarily a take that I would always be in the mood to listen to, given its somewhat discordant brass, but when I'm in the zone, this one's pretty impactful and haunting. The remaining 3 tracks on Forbidden Fruit are more spacious renditions of the songs by Bronski themselves. You've got the extended remix of No More War, which is less lyrical than the original, more of a soundscape that uses effects of air raid sirens and fighter jet radio snippets to make the point. This remix is okay, it's a little smoother than the original, but for me it's the least essential out of any of Bronski's own reworks here, not really bringing out anything particularly unexpected. Then there's the penultimate track, which is I Feel Love, again. This time it's in its 9-minute dub version, originally from a rare single release of the song in 1985, and despite how perverse it might seem to put you through this song again after the album's centerpiece, this version is genuinely different and interesting enough to warrant its place here. It does have a bit of a slow start as it keeps the Love to Love You Baby intro, but shorn of the original vocals, the composition on this part is a little too barren. But once the main beat gets going, the amount of subtle variations added in production to keep things vibrant is genuinely pretty impressive. Though in terms of reducing a song down to its bare essentials, the most spare reinvention is left till last. Screaming appears here in its stripped mix, which effectively reduces the song down to just Somerville, a shuffling drum machine, and some really ominous sparingly used keys. And no word of a lie, I think this version is amazing. The loneliness of the anxious mind that's presented here makes this song 10 times more personal for me. Let's not forget that Somerville already has a genuinely haunting voice, but hearing this version, I feel like I'm right there in his shoes, walking the same walk that he does on this one. Those occasional keys feel like ripples of danger in the vicinity. And then rather than verse chorus, the song ends with a convergence of a bunch of different vocal tracks from the original. That make it seem like a panic attack has full-blown erupted, or maybe something worse, something more external. It's a remix that communicates a lot with a little, and might be the most evocative version of the experience that Bronski Beat tried to communicate in their entire career. So that is Forbidden Fruit. Possibly the strangest remix album that I've heard so far this year. So many questions arose for me in terms of what tracks were included here, like why these remixes, why these tracks, why this year? Every time I felt like I got a handle on what this remix collection was about, each subsequent track would throw a curveball that led me well off the trail. And for that reason, I really enjoyed this album. Like Still Brat last year, it's one of those remix albums where I found the decision making just as fascinating and exciting as the actual sound of the music itself. Sometimes more so, I'll admit. But this album wasn't short of great sounding tracks, and in terms of my favourites, I do have a couple of honourable mentions. From the outsourced remixes, I'd peg RSF Metropol's version of Love and Money as the standout, a lush electro suite that felt simultaneously retro and modern in a way that really suited the Bronski Beat aesthetic. And from the BB's own contributions, it's probably an act of heresy that the Ultramix of I Feel Love was only my second favourite of the tracks here. And don't get me wrong, in terms of sheer monolithic excess and elaborate ridiculousness, this one definitely takes the queen-size bed as far as prizes go. But the track that I had the biggest emotional connection to out of everything here was the one that went furthest in the other direction. The isolated, intimate mindscape of the stripped mix of Screaming. Simplicity can be a hard thing to nail in remixing, but for me this take really got the vibes of the lyrics more than the original. And yeah, I found this version genuinely staggering. And for the least favourite remix, that honour also goes to RSF Metropol with his version of Need a Man Blues. Although I do need to flag up that this is very much an instance of least favourite remix rather than worst remix. It's perfectly solid. I just feel like out of everything here, it offered very little that I didn't feel Bronski's own productions already did more interestingly. And is this collection of remixes better than the original album? Kinda. Make no mistake, there's a rawness and strangeness of the Age of Consent that makes it stand out in a crowded field of 80s electropop. But there's also numerous elements of it that felt heavily tied to the time that it was made, despite the album subject matter largely transcending that. This remix collection felt like it really evoked the confusion and chaos of being queer in the 21st century. A world where the veneer of progress feels like it should be comforting, but the disorientation and hypernormalization of the world makes it feel like there's at least one step back for every couple of steps forward. Forbidden Fruit is a bizarre remix collection full of unexpected and sometimes mystifying ideas, and I genuinely can't think of a better way of illustrating the band's continued relevance than that. Anyways, that is my review. Do you agree with my opinions, disagree with my opinions? What do you think of the original album and this remix version? Please do let me know if there are any albums or EPs of remixes that you think I should cover in full on this channel, and if you want to see more remix-based content in the near future, hit that subscribe button. Thank you very much for watching. This review is over.